Hi, welcome back to my channel. This is another in a series of videos on the Racket programming language. Today we're going to start introducing the notion of macros. And to do this, we're going to use the following simple example. Let us say I wanted to do something in the language that looked like this. Now, of course, those Racket, there is a statement like that, but let's just assume that there wasn't. Or we wanted to use the specific syntax that we have here. Well, this is fairly simple to rewrite as a function. And that seems to work excellently. Let's say, though, someone comes later along and does the following. Well, now it's thrown this error goodbye, even though, well, it is false. So that should be the false value. But let's rerun it. Let's say it's true. Well, it also does the same thing. Is that it goes off and says, "Oh no." There's this error here. And the reason being is that when you call a function, and if then else is a function, all of the things that are passed into that function are evaluated. So in this case, it just sees a string hello, there's nothing to do here. Here, it sees that this is a, I think this is a special form in Scheme. I could be wrong, but it actually says, okay, you want to call error on goodbye. And then, of course, that's what this does. Is it creates an error goodbye and stops. It doesn't even go any farther. All right. So it seems like we may not be able to do this, but it turns out in Scheme and in Racket, there is a notion of what's called a macro. And in Racket, they more precisely call those syntax transformers. And what syntax transformers are is something that looks like the following. They give you this special form, define syntax. And you can give it the syntax you want to define. In this case, we want to define if then else. And it takes in a syntax object. And I'm just going to show you what that spits out at very first here. So I'm going to take away this. I'm going to replace it with this. Get back this example. Okay, we'll see what this does. So it's done first two things at first, and I'll just pull this up here a little bit. So it's gone off and it has printed this thing out. You can kind of see here that it is returning a syntax object, and it seems to have this list in here, these types of things, and it seems to have the syntax info. Okay, source. And the interesting about it is that the syntax basically seems to annotate this underlying X expression that appears in the code with information about where it appeared in the source code. It's like, where was the source? Here's the file. Where's the module? It doesn't have a module, so it just makes an anonymous one on. I have to look and see what position is. I'm kind of curious of where that figures out that that's the 66th position. But it says, hey, this is on line 0. It starts at column 0. It spans for 42 characters. And there's some other things here that probably for more advanced usages. So the question whether or not is that how can I access pieces of this? So looking off at the documentation, the first thing that struck out to me was there's this thing called so I did that. And now what it seemed to have done is it gave me back 3 syntax objects. Okay. It gave me back, said, okay, there's a T, hello, and goodbye. So it seems to have popped up and, oh wait, it seems to be like, okay, giving me these 3 things. Now that's pretty interesting. So there's still, but these are there's still these syntax things I want to do. What do I want to do with them, right? What's going on, so basically there's still syntax objects. How do I put them into something that I spit back out? So how do I create that syntax? So the first thing I'm going to do is, now that I have this, I'm going to basically chop this up as the following. I'm going to go ahead and say, all right, I'm going to let the syntax list to be syntax okay. Then I'm going to we should have 3 parts in here, it seems. So I'm going to let first be this should be the C value, or a C expression. I'll do C expression. Should be the first thing in that list. So we'll just go ahead and call first, and we'll go ahead and say first of the syntax list. Okay. Then we'll go the T value, or T expression should be second. Syntax list. And then the F expression should be third syntax list. And now what I want to do is, it's like, okay, can I go ahead and say the following, turn that into something that looked like that if then else statement. And so what I'm going to do here is like, oh yeah, I think I can do that. First of all, I'm going to use a quasi quote here to make this a little bit easier, and I'm going to basically go off and say, okay, I want that to look as the following. I want it to look something like this, cond C expression, but I actually want to evaluate what is the C expression, so unquote that. Okay, unquote T expression, and then else F expression. Okay. So let's run this, see what happens. Okay. First undefined cannot reference identifier before its definition. Okay. I was talking about this. And let's see if first it doesn't like first, so that's weird, but let's try this. Cannot reference it. Well, what's going on here? Okay. Why isn't first working? And so at first I was like, okay, wait a minute. Why isn't first working? Because if I do first, if I run this, it seems to be fine. Oh, wait a minute. No, actually, if I run this here, oh, it seems to be okay now. But let's see if I do this in the code here. It keeps going back to this. It says this is undefined. This is undefined. Now, I became very frustrated by this, and this is what will catch up a lot of people that are developing macros at first. And what it comes down to is the following. What's going on here is that there's basically what happens is that when Racket is defining and running macros, it is running at compile time. So when it is compiling the code is when syntax transformations are done. Okay. And so what happens is that there's error in syntax transformations. The compile doesn't complete. But that being said, what is going on here? First undefined, first undefined. So basically it's like, well, I forced it first to like require, and I said, okay, well, that's in Racket list, but that should be included in the Racket language, but I'm going to bring it in, that should be fine. And then I ran it, and it's the same thing. And then I looked through the documentation and then found out something that's really interesting. So at compile time, when it's compiling things, what it has available at compile time is a small subset of Racket. It seems to be Racket base. And the thing about it is that if I want to have more functions in there for the compiler to use at compiler time, I need to do the following. Require for syntax Racket list. And now it's suddenly changed on me. It says now syntax list is not defined. And that I put in there, that's more deliberate because I wanted to kind of go back and talk about, remember how lets work. Let's define all of these at the same time and basically in the same frame in the environment, for those of you who are aware of how that works. And so since they're all defined at the same time, I cannot refer to this here. So of course we need to use a let star. So that basically are defined. So lists, C expression, T expression are defined. Basically they're nested, so you can refer to values that they defined in a let before in the other objects. So let's see if this works. Okay. It's now, it says, oh, well, this, I don't know what this is, F expressor, but now I know that's fine because I added an R at the end. So let's see what happens. Okay. Received value from syntax expander that was not syntax. Not only that, but it seemed to have just crammed a bunch of this stuff in here, right? Hello. Okay, so how do I turn this into a syntax object? And so I was looking through this and I found a thing that looked like the following. There's a syntax. Creator syntax, blah. And I was like, oh, can I just give it this as list? And of course, it's not a quote, it's a quasi-quote at this point. And here it's like, well, I don't know. Once I did this, it said, I don't know what the C expression is, the T expression is, or the F expression is. Those are not available. Don't know what those mean. And so I was like, well, let me double check. Is it really because of that? Let me take a look. And sure enough, it does seem to be like, okay, that is not there. So moving on, what I eventually found is the following, is that there is a function called this, datum to syntax. And the thing about it is that I have to give it a syntax object as context. And then it seemed to have taken this and tries to turn it into syntax. So let's see what happens if I do this. Okay. So actually it's a first contract violation expected. Interesting. So it seems to be complaining that first contract violation, it was given false. So syntax list here. Let's take a look and see. So this is interesting. Let me take a look at here and let's we can pop into the debugger here. Should be able to add something like that. So maybe we'll go step. And of course, well, what? Oh my gosh, goodness gracious. We can't use the debugger. This is happening at compile time. This is before the debugger even hits anything. So we're going to stop this now. And the question now becomes, what can we do? And there is something that can help us here. There is this macro stepper. And let's take a look what the macro transformation is. So again, it's complained, cond if then else t else hello. So this is interesting. So what's the syntax list here? Doesn't seem to give us some enough information here. So let's go back here and let's kind of take a step back. We'll take things here and we'll go ahead and print. See what this does. Oh, it's missing a body, of course. Okay. So now I got a little bit, so it seems to, oh yes, okay. So it has the if then else, the T and stuff like that. So this doesn't seem to be quite what we want here either. We want to be able to go off and say, it seems like the condition value or condition expression is the second in the syntax list. And let's just go ahead and confirm this by printing out C expression. Let's take a look here. Again, it's not happy with some of this, what's going on here. Ow. Okay. T expression undefined. Okay, so did it print? Okay, so it printed out the syntax object, which is T. So let's keep moving forward here. And all of a sudden, it seems that we have now gotten to a place where this has done what we think it's going to do. But okay, and now it's worked. So the thing about it is that now let's take a look at the macro stepper here again. And this is a very useful thing when you're doing macros in Racket, is to take a look and see what has gone over here. And so now we've taken a look at the step. Take a look at the macro, basically it's like take a look at the macro transformation here, and it's gone off and says, yeah, this is what's been spit out. And so we have indeed seemed to have done what we wanted to do. So the thing about this is that you have to get very used to a couple of things. One is that this does happen at compile time, not at when you try to hand this off to the REPL. And so what happens is that this is literally what the compiler has done is that at this compile time is taken and replaced this syntax with the new thing, and later has just run it as if that was there all along. So it's literally taken this piece of code and replaced it with something that looks exactly like we would expect. And so that is hard enough to get around it. But once you think about that, that gets fairly natural because you understand, okay, there's a different phase in which you have to import certain types of things if you want a second, third, and fourth, that you can see that that's where this comes from right there. The next thing about it is that this whole how to turn lists into syntax back and forth. Excuse me. And the thing about that that's difficult is that when you look at them, when you create a set of syntax, when you create syntax like this, the datum syntax, it needs a context. And most examples I've seen, and I'll put a link to the reference I used, not only was the documentation, but a great article by Greg Hendershott called The Fear of Macros. I will link that into this video description, is that you need a context. And the reason you need a context when you create a syntax object is it literally wants to know things like, well, what line was this put on? How long is this? And so it adds in that sort of information so that you still have things like debug information and all these other types of things in the context that you need when you're actually, running the thing. And so that's what you do. Now, the interesting thing about it is I'm still doing some research is that how you could potentially create a syntax object from scratch that has maybe a different context than you would want if you ever want to do that. If so, when there would be that necessary. So I am still trying to figure that out. The other thing about that too is that it's when you need to, basically, how do you turn syntax objects into their fundamental value is that just like we found out, oh, there's this way of taking this list or just any value and turning it into a syntax. And that's what datum is that basically any value, S expression, integer, string, vector, you name it. That basically, and turn it into a syntax object. There's a way of taking a syntax object and turning it into its underlying datum. And so that's what this does. So in the sense, we have created a new, not a new function, but a new special form, if you can think about it that way, that does not exist in the core macro language, is core Racket language. Now, this is a very powerful thing. And the reason that I bring it up is that if you look at Racket itself, there's a lot of things that are defined in this manner. For example, we were introduced to define structs like this. And I don't think struct is in Racket. No, it is. Okay. And that ended up defining a bunch of functions, so we could do, I believe, name. Let's see. It should be make name, I believe. Oh, this is odd. Oh. Yeah. So we have things like make name, we have name, so on and so forth. You know, and all this, and the ways, and the reason I bring this up is that what the struct is struct is defined as a complex macro, and so it's literally doing what this does up here is that it's creating a new this new syntax for define struct that creates a bunch of functions and defines them in the current environment. And a lot of things in Racket, a lot of the special forms are created not by just adding them to like the compiler, but as basically macro code, and makes for a very extensible language in the fact that Racket really, when it comes down to it, you look at it, actually has you can have very few primitives to get things done. Basically, you have, with the macro functionality, you can basically have let, lambda, and a few other things, and you're good to go. You can do the rest with macros and all sorts of stuff. So that makes it so that you take this very tiny core and expand it using macros to create a much more full and functional language. So what we're going to do in the next exercises, and I might do this as a set of live coding videos, is I'm going to define, I want to be able to do something called define record, and it's going to look very much like define syntax, except it's going to be simpler. It's not going to have all the options that struct does, excuse me, not define syntax, just define struct. And what records are is that they're going to be immutable, so you can't change any of the types of any of the values, but you'll be able to have some accessors like, you know, basically name get first or name first for a record, and so on and so forth. I have to define what the model what the model is and what I want it to look like. The most interesting thing is I want to be able to define a thing that basically defines the following with, and if I give it basically a record, and I do something like this, what it'll do is it'll create a new record where all of the fields in this record are the same except for the last record field, which will now have this value. And so basically you can make a new record by copying most of something in a record into a new record. And this is kind of inspired by C#, what it does with the records. It defines a similar type of thing for records. And it'll be interesting to see how to get this to work in a macro language. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.